So class, here we are at module 3, and so the purpose of this module really is to look at all the multiple ideas and concepts out there that are essentially barriers or challenges to creating morals and following through with ethical decision making. So we're going to look at the ideas of cultural relativism and subjectivism, the ideas of free will, determinism, and compatibilism, and then look a little bit about some of the, in the study of behavioral ethics, we're going to look at some of the heuristics, which are schemas that human beings have. So there's all sorts of schemas, which are called heuristics, that we create. And some of them that help us make decisions keep us from really making clear-cut, rational decisions. And then I want you to create a philosophical argument for discussion post 3 about the challenges to morality and ethical behavior. Okay, so I think the James Rachel's article is really excellent in here, the challenge of cultural relativism. So I'm not going to repeat some of his examples because I think they're just excellent on their own. And you can really get a lot out of his work, which touches on some information from the history of Herodotus and finding out the different groups in Greece. One group that believed in eating a part of their dead. So, and then also we're talking about the Eskimos. But the essential idea of cultural relativism is that different cultures have different ethical standards, and that is okay. So no culture is the same, nor should they be. So for example, for a lot of things, this doesn't really bother people. You go, oh yes, you have a different marriage practice, or you have a different religion, or you have a different way of making decisions in society. But there's some things that kind of, you have when you look at it on face value. I want you to really think about this. What do you think about cultural relativism when we're talking about something like female circumcision? It's practiced in some cultures. It's not a religious thing. Some cultures have created this story about the need for young girls to have their clitoris or labia removed. So clearly, many cultures don't think that's okay. But in the idea of cultural relativism, there are no absolute moral truth. So it's okay for one group to remove female pleasure centers, and it's not okay for another group. So what I want you to see, and this is the thing that philosophy really wants you to look at, is the fact that the problem with cultural relativism, it's so illogical, because it's saying that two diametrically opposed ideas can both be true. So what other issues does it raise, right? So think about all the different examples given in the James Rachel's article. You probably can think of something else. I always bring up female circumcision because, hey, it seems kind of, I'll be honest, kind of awful. So I'm so glad I don't live in a culture that practices that. I bet you are too. So the challenge of subjectivism, which is kind of similar to cultural relativism, except that instead of just saying that your culture is different, you say all truths are subject to the individual. Now, I notice students have a tendency to believe in subjectivism. Like, it's okay for you to think that and for me to think this. Freedom of views, right? everyone's entitled to their opinion. There's no objective truth or value. All values are relative. So, and it's okay, right? You can live your life, I can live my life. Your truth is different from my truth, but that's okay because we're different individuals. Now, notice a lot of you rely on that in you always have to keep making that argument. And I think it's because you just don't want to piss each other off and you don't want to say, hey, I think that maybe there's some things that are just not okay. So what would you say if I told you that it's my truth that if you have, green eyes, it's okay for me to kill you? And this is an ethical idea that I came up with because I think green-eyed people ruin the gene pool. So you don't have a problem with that, do you? Because it's my truth, right? So what we get to is maybe some things don't combat, but if we talk about if my sense of values say, hey, it's okay for me to kick you out of my country because you're not really a part of my culture, and I can treat you like shit if I want to. So the Buddhists in Myanmar who are kicking out the Muslim group, saying it's perfectly ethical for us to kick you out. We don't want you here anymore. We don't like you. We don't like what you're doing. And so you've got to go. So we're going to kill you. And that's okay. It's actually called genocide. So what I want you to see is that there is some challenges ethically to these ideas of cultural relativism and subjectivism. The other thing I want you all to press you to think about is, do you really think there aren't some things that are just universally wrong? I mean, that's a legitimate question. You could say, no, I don't think there's anything. But think about it. Is there anything that you could say is universally wrong? Is human trafficking ever okay? Right? Is it ever okay to intentionally withhold food from a person? Maybe you would say yes. Maybe in some instances, as someone who wants to die, who is an elder and who is not, maybe that is okay. So I want you to begin to look at all of the challenges that we face when we go about talking about moral theories and the problems that occur when we're trying to have a conversation about this stuff and make some decisions. Okay, so in the world of philosophy, you kind of have to sort of get used to some of the lingo. So free will is really an integral belief in the Judeo-Christian worldview and traditions. So this is actually very much a part of our dominant culture. And it's the idea that people are free to choose to act or not to act. So because this is true, people are responsible for their choices. Libertarian philosophers say that, a free act is something that happens out of the choice of a free agent. And the free agent is responsible for the free act. So I bet a lot of us believe this, right? It's a part of our worldview. So on the other hand, we have determinism. So when we talk, so sometimes people talk about the difference between free will and predestination, but we're going to leave aside any religious deterministic views about the nature of the world being predetermined by a divine entity. We're going to just leave that to the side. But there's actually quite a few scientists who would claim that the world is determined by other forces. Behavioral psychology believes in a deterministic worldview. And the hard determinists say freedom does not exist. There's no such thing as free will. We're creatures of habit, and every event follows in a causal relationship with the events that came before. Soft determinism, which is also sometimes called compatibilism. Notice I have actually misspelled the word here, so it should be B-I-L-I-S-M. Sorry about that. But compatibilism is the idea that some events are determined and some are subject to some free aspects of the world. So I'm not going to say too much more about this because I've uploaded in the next page some really good videos on free will and determinism. So I think those kind of mitigate against my skipping over this a little quickly. So one of the things that is really interesting is ethics, and the exploration of ethics really does move outside the domain and the discipline of philosophy. In fact, we can see that both psychologists, social psychologists, and sociologists have noticed some things, which there's a new field, behavioral ethics, and behavioral ethics is the field that looks at what are some of the psychological schemas or tendencies, heuristics, if you will, that keep human beings from actually being able to think rationally and clearly, and to actually keep them from making ethical decisions. So the point is, people do bad things all the time. And so some of you said that you thought the biggest problem is that people don't have morals. I actually don't buy that. I don't buy that people don't know what's right and wrong. But I do think that maybe what we're not aware of are all of the challenges that people face when they come to making decisions. So let's just look at some of these heuristics that are called challenges to ethics. So the first one, confirmation bias. Now think about you and your worldview. And I don't care what you think politically or believe religiously or anything like that. I mean, I don't mean I don't care. I just mean it doesn't matter if we agree or disagree, in my mind. But confirmation bias is the tendency that we all have to seek information that conforms to what we already believe. Think about all those Facebook posts. Do you just get people get sort of like frothing at the mouth when they find somebody there like, yeah, I agree with you, and this and this and this. But actually the algorithms on Facebook are set up so we're going to end up seeing the things that we already agree with more than we are going to see posts of things that we disagree with, right? Even the fact that sometimes, I have some friends from high school, and I went to school a long time ago. I'm 52, so it happened a while ago. And sometimes, I like the people. I went to school with them, but we don't have the same worldview. And sometimes I kind of I don't unfriend them, but I just kind of unfollow them. Do you ever do that? Just kind of unfollow somebody? Well, think about that. That's kind of an element of confirmation bias, because I don't want to have to deal with those disagreements all the time. So I have a tendency only to seek out information that I already agree with. How can we really make ethical decisions if we're not able to look at things truthfully? The second bias listed, overconfidence bias, is this tendency to be overconfident and perhaps unrealistic in one's own abilities. So we have a tendency to think we're better at something than we actually are. Maybe you think this is a good thing, but can you see how this might be a challenge to ethical decision making? There's something called the bandwagon effect. It's also something called groupthink, which was created by the sociologist Irving Janis. And he noticed this, there's this tendency, if you have a group of people who have to make a decision, the tendency is, even if there's one or two people in the whole group who disagree with the majority, they're more likely to go along with what the majority thinks, because they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to seem to be argumentative. So that groupthink is this tendency. And actually, we've had all sorts of horrible things happen, like the space shuttle Challenger disaster back in, what was it, 1985, where we find out it's because some engineer didn't have the guts to tell the group that something was wrong. So actually, this has a huge impact on us. The fact that sometimes people are not able to speak out against the group, even if they have a moral problem. There is this idea, there's such a thing as an optimism bias or wishful thinking. So we have a tendency to think the best despite information to the contrary. Oh, well, I'll just keep my thoughts positive. How does that get in the way of, you might think, well, that's a great recipe for happiness in life. I mean, I know that some of you talked about that in your first discussion, but how is it a barrier to clear thinking? Okay, here's another one. There's more. It's disgusting how many biases we have that are kind of, I don't know, almost built in. So here's another one. There's the in-group bias. We have a tendency to believe our own social or cultural group over outsiders, right? They're the other. So we have a bias towards people we already know. So can you see how these 5 examples, and there could be 50 different kinds of heuristic distortions that we have in our thinking. So this is something to keep in mind. So when we talk about morality is on the decline, maybe morality has never been on the up and up, because human beings have a tendency to lie to themselves. So the other thing that I wanted to say is, we can see in writing and an analysis that there's actually illogical or incorrect thinking, otherwise called fallacious thinking, which is often used to persuade people. These are rhetorical devices that are used to persuade someone of the rightness or wrongness of an argument, rather than the logic or the rationality of the argument. You can see this in advertising, you can see this in political ad campaigns. So there's appeal to anger, appeal to pity, appeal to shame, appeal to some kind of emotion. You got to get mad, we're going to get those terrorists. So whatever argument that's made out of emotion really is it's kind of a psychological manipulation used by people. It's a faulty argument as well. So you also want to avoid these in your own writing. Argumentum ad hominem is argument to the person or argument to the man. And that basically means making an argument based on insulting the other person. Oh, Nietzsche died of syphilis, so I shouldn't read Nietzsche. Nietzsche did die of syphilis, but why should you not read Nietzsche, right? For that reason. We have these weird sort of moral standards about health. Here's one we do a lot: jump to conclusion. I bet you can come up with some examples in your own life, right? One time a student told me that this is their example. It's pretty good. So one student said, they're trying to plan a surprise party for their girlfriend. And so it was a boyfriend, and the boyfriend was communicating in secret with the girl's best friend and some other people. So somehow the girlfriend got a hold of the boyfriend's phone and assumed he was having an affair, when, in fact, he was planning a birthday party for her. Psych! There's also the appeal to tradition. We've always done it this way. That's why we do it, right? This is the way we've always done it. Or that person is the teacher or an authority, so that must be true. No. Whatever I say is never true just because I'm the one saying it. It's either true or false based on the evidence. So you might be familiar with some other common fallacies in writing, which one would be a red herring, which is kind of a distraction. And politicians use this a lot. Somebody asks them one question and they say, well, I want to talk about, child care instead of health care. So they distract from one thing or another. A straw man is a fake argument or a misrepresentation of the person's argument. I think this might be a little easier to detect the black or white either or fallacy. Either they're good or they're bad. Either they're evil or good. And then there's also the false analogy. So using an incorrect analogy or simile to explain something. So comparing, this is kind of cliche, but this is the cliche that helps you understand the concept of false analogy. And that is comparing apples to oranges. So you'll notice that the reading for this week is all designed to make you think about what are the limits and the challenges to moral decision making. So one overarching question you'll see in the last two authors is moral action rational? So there's two articles, chapter 11 and 12, the nature of ethical disagreement and the rationality of moral action. So there's two authors who kind of arguing with each other. So look at that. So one says moral action is rational, and the other doesn't agree. So what evidence supports this idea? And what do you think about this idea? What evidence supports the idea that moral action is more relational than rational? And then on another, why are there so many barriers to ethical action and ethical decision making? And this is my question. Are we human beings just hardwired to lie to ourselves? We seem to do a lot of things which are perpetuating kind of an overconfident, overblown idea about ourselves and our ability to be fair and rational. So what do you think about that? So I look forward to reading your work and talking more about this.